So I'm here in Switzerland, in Geneva, with Noor bin Laden. We were at the protest a few days ago, and I thought you are quite an expert on WHO stuff going on here in Switzerland, so it's excellent that you could sit down here and tell us a little bit more about it.
Well, thank you so much for having me for this sit down. This is the second time we do an interview together.
Yes.
I had the pleasure of sitting down with you, but it was virtual when you invited me on your podcast earlier this year. So doing this in person is really special.
Yeah.
And on that note, I'd like to thank you for coming all the way from Norway to be here with us and to protest the WHO during their World Health Assembly this year. It's been amazing having you here. So thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you. It was great coming here. It was awesome to see all the people coming to protest against the WHO, and your speech was amazing.
So was yours.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, there's a lot happening here in Geneva when it comes to the globalists and their machinations, and I mean, it is their diplomatic capital, and Switzerland was very much selected to be kind of this center for all these, or this base rather, for all these international organizations, including the United Nations and its sister or daughter organization, rather, the WHO. So it's important to shed a light on what's going on here. I wouldn't say I'm an expert on the WHO. I just look at the history of globalism and WHO, how it fits into the architecture that the globalists have been building for the past 100 years. You know, that's quite conservative. I would say it's much longer. We can look at the roots of this even as early as the early 19th century. But yeah, so no, I'm not an expert specifically to the WHO. There are many incredible people.
But you've done a lot of good work on globalism as a whole, World Economic Forum stuff. You were at Davos, WHO, and all of these things.
Yeah, let's just say that as, you know, Swiss national. For those who don't know, I'm Swiss from my mom's side, and I was born and raised here. So it just is, you know, circumstances of life. There are many strange circumstances in my life, but this is one of them, and so it puts me in a certain position to speak about all these things from the belly of the beast, so to speak. Yeah.
So tell me more about the WHO, because they are having their World Health Assembly, the 75th one, right now. 76th. Oh.
No, but you know why it's confusing? Because all of the T-shirts, they have 75.
Yeah.
Because it's been 75 years, and this is the 76th assembly. I was actually confused when I saw all the T-shirts with 75 as well. I had to
So it's the 76th.
Yeah.
So they are meeting right here in Geneva. Not a few kilometers from where we're sitting right now. We are in the old town here. They've been meeting here for a whole week, planning, plotting, sinister things.
Yes, very well put.
What can you tell us?
Well, maybe just in general, you know, what is the WHO, when it was formed? I mean, we just mentioned, you know, it was formed 75 years ago. It was directly right at the aftermath of World War II. It was very much in the very early, or it was right at the inception of the United Nations when they had this conference. I believe it was in 1945 in San Francisco, where they were drawing up all the plans for the United Nations. I mean, they were already drawn up, but they were like starting the process of rolling them out, because we know that the United Nations is the follow-up to the League of Nations, which was set up after the First World War, but it failed to carry on the mission of creating a one world government. It was the test run, but because the United States didn't join at the time, thanks to the population of the United States and the fact that the Senate wasn't as corrupted as it is today, the will of the people was able to prevail, and so they rejected the League of Nations. And that's, you know, I mean, you can look at history in many different ways, but, you know, we had World War II that followed that a few years later, and they were finally able, through the iteration of the United Nations, to start setting up the foundations for this centralization of power, and namely this one world government. And the WHO is very much a key part of that, as the world health body that is handling all matters relating to the health of populations of different nations, but at a supranational level, under the guise of coordinating with different nations in order to respond to different crises.
Yeah, because a lot of people hear about the UN and all of these organizations related to WHO and so on. People think it's all being set up for world peace. We saw some of that on one of the murals that we have some footage of as well. They talk about it's for peace, it's for all of this stuff, but in reality it's actually something else that is the ultimate goal from what I can gather and see.
Absolutely, it's like this massive giant Trojan horse, the United Nations and all this infrastructure around diplomacy and international institutions worldwide. You know, the UN is obviously one of the pillars of this architecture, as I like to say, you know, the globalist architecture they've been building throughout the 20th century. But there are many different components, many different entities, NGOs, the corporations, our very own captured governments, the media complex. I alluded to that in my speech as well. Throughout the 20th century, as I just mentioned, they've just infiltrated and weaponized many of our institutions. They've set up different institutions like the UN and all its daughter organizations to move towards this goal of the centralization of powers by a top ruling caste. And effectively, the idea is to erode our national sovereignty in terms of individual nations, but also in terms of our own as individuals ourselves. Under the guise that supposedly nations are not equipped to deal with certain crises or certain health threats. And this was very much actually the narrative that was used to set up the League of Nations Health Organization. So even the League of Nations, so even the League of Nations had a health organization, which is actually the predecessor to the World Health Organization we know today under the UN. And even then, that body was driven by so-called foundations and philanthropic vehicles. I mean, specifically, we're talking about the Rockefeller Foundation here, and they were the driving force behind the League of Nations Health Organization back then, through this arm of the Rockefeller Foundation called the International, I want to say Bureau of Health or body. I note it here, because you know the nomenclature of all these organizations. I mean, you really need to memorize them. It's the Rockefeller Foundation International Health Board.
Okay.
And I came across certain correspondence, you know, from 1922 between a director of the Rockefeller Foundation International Health Board to another, the guy who followed up in the position as director of that body, stating that we needed to recognize the limitations of nation states in dealing with certain health matters of an international nature. So the narrative 101 years ago from that correspondence that I found was exactly the same as the narrative that they're using today, stating that these so-called health emergencies and these so-called pandemics show that there needs to be international coordination and there needs to be a supranational body like the WHO in order to manage, respond, prepare, prevent. They have all these terms, these types of crises. And you look at the WHO documentation today and it's all about this, and we can go into that a bit more during our conversation.
Yeah.
But that's a little bit the history.
This has been going on for a long time. It's not something new that's just happened recently. They've been doing this for decades and decades and decades to push more and more towards a kind of a one world government thing. And we're seeing
under the guise of pandemics
peace and
using pandemics and health crises and climate change.
Yes,
and
climate change.
excuses.
Yeah, that's
It's always the same playbook. They have these crises that to a large extent they manufacture and they launch and then they weaponize against us in order to then push their agenda in a so-called effort to help us or save us. And it couldn't be clearer, I think, with what has happened the last 3 or 4 years with the COVID and the narrative that they're using right now, and it's been said so many times the past 8 days during the World Health Assembly, and even before that, it's been actually a core part of the messaging of the WHO and many different leaders worldwide of our own governments and the press and medical journals like the Lancet, etc. They're all pushing this narrative. We need to learn from our mistakes during COVID. We weren't able to coordinate as well as we should have. We need to have this global architecture for pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response. These are the terms that they use in their documentation. So they're using COVID as the excuse to further crack down on our liberties and using it as a justification to implement their agenda, which we have to talk about because it's so sinister.
No, I definitely think when you look at it, it's been what happened. It's at least been a test run for implementing all of these systems, and now the question is what is going to be planned further. Because of course you have Agenda 2030, these certain things before 2030, and I know that the WHO, they are working specifically to achieve the health goals outlined in Agenda 2030. So it's all part of the same thing. But let's go in a little bit into what they are doing here right now. The WHO here in Geneva, they are working on the pandemic treaty. What can you tell us about that?
What you just said was so important because you're absolutely right. It is about the UN Sustainable Development Goals and it is about Agenda 2030. And it's very sinister / interesting to see how the WHO fits into this, because you just mentioned they are working on a pandemic accord. They called it treaty, this is how it's commonly referred to, the pandemic treaty. But they're also working on the amendments to the international health regulations. And so these are 2 tracks. In order, they will be, how would you say, complementary to each other, but by advancing on both tracks, they are trying to set up the legal framework that will give the WHO the powers to supersede national laws in the event of a next pandemic, which they have all assured us is going to happen, and it's going to be much worse.
Just heard about Pandemic X recently.
Yeah, I mean, there are so many different names, that they're using. They're conditioning us through the media as well to prepare for the next one. This is also part of predictive programming. But Tedros said, about a week ago at the outset of the World Health Assembly, he said there will be a next pandemic and it's going to be much worse and even deadlier. He used this wording. And what they're trying to achieve with these 2 legal instruments is to basically grant the Director General of the WHO total power over all of the nations that are member states to the WHO. And that means, in terms of how they want to handle pandemics, it's not just about responding to pandemics. And what I've been saying, the past days reporting on this, is that the word surveillance is absolutely key to every single thing that the WHO is in the process of implementing. And under the guise of wanting to prevent and prepare for the next health crisis or the next health emergency, because all of this sits under the health emergencies program of the WHO, they want to grant themselves powers to track and monitor potential threats. And this includes, genomic surveillance, and we can go into the different initiatives and tools, that they've launched, maybe not for this conversation, but I can mention like a couple. So on the eve of the World Health Organization's, the World Health Assembly's first day here in Geneva, they launched what they call the IPSN, the International Pathogen Surveillance Network.
Okay.
So this sits under the WHO's hub for pandemic and epidemic response or preparedness, because they have all these different, the bureaucracy is just insane of all these groups within the WHO.
Yeah, well, I saw that with all the buildings. They have one building after another, after
Yeah.
another, after another. How many people are sitting in there working, wasting time, or maybe not wasting time for them, planning
Plotting
plotting
as you
things,
said
yeah.
earlier, yeah. But so you have that initiative, this network, and then you have the global genomic surveillance strategy. You
Yeah.
have all these different tools that they're putting in place, and these instruments will give the legal basis to the WHO to just roll them out. And
Yeah.
then once they do declare, let's say, a pandemic,
Yeah,
the member states that will have ratified the amendments to the international health regulations and who would have signed the pandemic accord,
Yeah.
they would essentially be beholden, to the WHO and what they decide.
Yeah.
And what they decide, meaning lockdowns, meaning forced vaccinations, meaning quarantines, meaning travel restrictions, meaning digital health certificates, i.e. digital passports, all of the member states, 194 of them, will have to abide by WHO regulations. They
Yeah.
would no longer be recommendations that
Be
member states can
forced.
choose to adopt or not. They will be legally binding, and
Yeah.
that's like the whole crux of these modifications they want to make.
Yeah, and I also heard something about that the WHO can force countries to censor what they deem to be misinformation as well.
Yeah, so that's
So
also
it's
something that's
free
part
speech
of the,
going away as well.
Yeah, they're calling it infodemic management.
Yeah,
Yeah, so that's the program. They're also working very much on the censorship side, and with the European Union, the European Council,
Yeah.
all the different bodies, they're all coordinating together in order to cramp down on all of our rights, and freedom of speech is a key one,
Yeah.
because they don't want people like us
to
sharing what it is they're plotting,
Yeah.
basically.
exactly.
Yeah. Another thing I wanted to mention with regards to both these instruments, the Pandemic Accord and the International Health Regulations, is that they both have provisions to monitor the compliance of member states. So they want to establish a compliance committee and also some form of peer review mechanisms to make sure that the member states are going to comply with both these instruments. So that's something that is quite alarming as well. It's that these nations, these member states to the WHO, the 194 of them, they are driving this process. They are the ones proposing these amendments to the WHO, changing the wording so that they're not recommendations any longer, but they become legally binding provisions, etc. So our own governments, the people who are supposed to represent us, are the ones driving this process
Yeah.
of relinquishing our sovereignty to this institution that nobody has elected in the first place.
So they're giving power away to unelected elites
Yeah,
that nobody voted for.
exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah, and it's especially the case when you look at, for example, the U.S. Federal government and the Biden regime, where they are actually the ones that kick-started the process to amend the international health regulations as per the constitution of the WHO.
yeah,
And it was the deputy assistant to HHS, the Department of Health and Human Resources to the federal government in the United States, Lois Pace.
Yeah.
She's the one who sent a letter to the Director General of the WHO, Tedros Ghebreyesus, asking and proposing a set of amendments to the international health regulations. That was in January 2022. And then in September 2022, you had Xavier Becerra, the secretary of HHS, who actually met with Tedros in Washington, D.C. to signal to the world and hold a press conference, essentially to what's the word I'm looking for? They wanted to solidify their relationship, the relationship between the U.S. government and the WHO. They held
getting
what was
closer
called,
together.
Yeah, it was called like a strategic dialogue, and in that dialogue, you know, that meeting that they had in Washington D.C., the U.S., the captured U.S. government, essentially reaffirmed its commitment to facilitating the WHO's power grab over our nations. So you have the U.S. that started that process of driving the international health regulation amendments, but then back in 2021, in I think March 2021, you had 25 leaders, I believe, including Boris Johnson at the time. So Boris Johnson was very much driving this. They put out a letter calling the WHO to start a pandemic treaty, to work on a pandemic treaty. So it was the leaders of all of these countries that got together. You also had Tedros, that was a signatory to that letter, and also the president of the European Commission or Council. I get lost in the nomenclature, but these two leaders, but then all the other ones were leaders of heads of governments, heads of state of different countries, publishing this letter urging the WHO to start working on a pandemic treaty. And following that call to action and many different actions that were taken in parallel, the WHO set up the intergovernmental negotiating body, the INB, which is the group at the WHO tasked with drafting this treaty. Drafting this treaty.
So now they're working on it. It's not finished yet. They're going to finish it at the next health assembly, from what I understand. The pandemic treaty.
So they've been having regular meetups here in Geneva on a quite tight schedule. The plan, the official plan, is to continue negotiating this treaty until the next World Health Assembly here in Geneva in May 2024, and the objective is to ratify this pandemic accord
officially
a year from now. So we don't have much time. Because in essence, once these two instruments are accepted and ratified by the member states, it means the complete loss of our sovereignty as nations and as individuals.
Yeah, because some people have been, like with Brexit, they're worried that the European Union will be getting too much power over the UK and so on, but here we're getting something that is getting power over countries all over the world, much bigger than just the European Union.
Yes, completely. And the WHO, as I say, is the chosen institution by the globalists to usher this in. It's like a weaponized institution under the guise of, saving lives. They are actually harming and hurting lives. And that's what I said in my speech on Sunday at the protest.
One thing I find quite interesting is the World Health Organization. They say that they're doing this for people's health and everything, but they never talk about a certain... I want to put this video on YouTube, so I'm going to be careful with my words here, but there was a certain thing that over the last few years that people got that have been causing a lot of excess deaths and so on, and they are not talking about that at all.
No.
Don't you find that a bit funny that they are talking about the health? Again, we see that it is just a front for something else. They don't actually care about people's health. Something else is going on.
But that's been going on since its inception. And if you look at the history of the WHO, and I also mentioned this in the speech, their track record is abysmal. And they've been embroiled in so many scandals because of, scandals of so many different natures, just medical malpractice, scientific fraud, widespread corruption. The list is very long, including with previous pandemics, like swine flu. COVID was the warm-up for the next one, but they were a few trial runs before COVID, when you look at and the history. And so, no, I mean, we started a website with my friend Nick Cerruti, who is also Geneva-based, called We Hurt Others, WHO, wehurtothers.com. And we wanted to do a repository of information about the real WHO. And so it's a website that has official documentation, that has links to films, documentaries, like interviews with different people, incredible articles, because you do have a lot of people trying to expose this that are doing a phenomenal job, including WHO whistleblowers, including doctors, including experts on the WHO, which I'm not. But we wanted to put all of this information together so that people can go and actually learn about the WHO, and we wanted to help people disseminate this information because there's just so much. So we tried to organize it in a way that is more digestible for people.
Yeah, no, excellent. And I'll leave a link so people can find your site, of course.
Thank you. And there's maybe one thing we should mention, because I know you wanted to talk about the protests, and me too. I mentioned surveillance. I mentioned maybe we should talk just a little bit about the overall agenda of the WHO in 1 minute, because what's happening as well is that not only under the guise of health emergencies, but under the guise of working towards the well-being of everyone, which was what you were just saying, they want to offer universal health coverage across the world to everyone. This is part of
socialized medicine.
Exactly. And this is part of their agenda, which they call the 300 billion targets. So I have it right here, actually, and I can show it to the audience. This is the document that you can find on the WHO's website, and we added it to wehurtothers.com. And I wanted to read this key sentence and mention the 300 billion targets, but this goes hand in hand with the surveillance point I made earlier. So this is the quote. 2 words, measurable impact, are at the heart of WHO's plans to transform the future of public health. The focus is on using timely, reliable, actionable data to improve the health of billions of people. The 300 billion targets are fundamental to how this plan will be achieved and monitored. And so the 3 targets, the 1 billion targets, the first one is target 1 billion more people benefiting from universal health coverage without financial hardship. So this is about centralizing and making the entire healthcare system uniform globally. And with that, we're looking at the digitization of the healthcare infrastructure.
Bill Gates's global digital ID maybe comes into play here with this thing.
I think that one comes into play with just the whole agenda. The second target is target 1 billion more people better protected from health emergencies, and this is what we've been talking about,
pandemic,
the whole conversation. And so this is where the IHR and the pandemic accord come in, and the last one, and the whole surveillance program, etc. And the last target, which is so vague and broad, is target 1 billion more people enjoying better health and well-being. And this is about broadening the WHO's mandate and, ramming in climate change in there and different, health emergencies related to climate as well. This is the One Health
Dr.
agenda.
Dr. Tedros at the beginning at the World Health Assembly said that the climate crisis is a health crisis. So they're going to be using that for
just widespread for everything. And so to the point you were making earlier about the thing we cannot talk about because it's going to be on YouTube, and that has led to increased deaths the past 3 years since their introduction, is that they're rolling out mass inoculation programs as well through the WHO. And there is one latest initiative which is called the Big Catch Up, in coordination with Chelsea Clinton, who is a spokesperson for it, and also the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. They launched this initiative to catch up our children who missed out apparently on many different other shots during COVID. They want to catch them up in their immunization schedule.
Okay.
And so they're targeting our children, and this obviously in any case includes the COVID shot as well. And you have many different inoculation programs that they're also rolling out across the world. And so in order to keep track of these shots, they're using that as a justification to implement the digital health certificates, i.e. digital passports, because they need to be able to track what shots you've had or not. So everything is kind of tied together, and behind this Trojan horse of health, they are basically ushering a mass surveillance, total control architecture of the population. And I mean, this is what the protest was about on Sunday. We don't want this type of governance and this type of tyranny.
Yeah, because there was this protest that we were speaking at. People came. We got the bell ringer. People came as well. They stood outside ringing their bells. What do you think about the protest compared to before the Swiss, the Swiss people? What do they think about all this stuff?
Switzerland is a very peculiar place because, as I mentioned at the beginning of this conversation, we are very much the home of the globalists. We are the base that they have chosen. 200 years ago, after the Congress of Vienna in 1815, Switzerland was clearly selected by the globalists, even back then, as their base. I'm repeating myself, but this is really the case, and you can look at it throughout the 19th century. I mean, the first real international organization of that nature was the Red Cross, and it was founded here in Geneva in 1863. And then you had a few years later, a few decades later rather, you had the League of Nations, which was also headquartered here. And then, the UN, which, has its headquarters here. Their official window headquarters is in New York, but where all of the administrative work is getting done for all these UN-affiliated organizations is here in Geneva. So Geneva is a very peculiar place. Our government is very much enmeshed with the globalist architecture, and I think it's everywhere the same across the world. We've all kind of been lulled into believing the narrative that they've sold to us, that they are operating for the well-being of mankind. But as I also say, behind the veneer of these lofty terms and these noble ideals, when you actually go and read the documentation, the agenda is very clear. We are not conspiracy theorists, as they like to call us. Everything is out in the open.
They call you conspiracy theorists because they try and discredit. They don't want the truth getting out, so they just try and discredit what you have to say by calling you names.
Yeah, but it's all there. It's all in the documentation, and I've been a bit drowning in all of the official documents of the WHO. It's just all in the documentation, in the official documentation. And behind very positive sounding words, you'll actually start to realize once you read the documentations that they are anything but working in a positive way for humanity.
And I don't know if you mentioned this before, but one thing I was wondering, how did all of these organizations end up here in Geneva? Because we walked around, looked at all the buildings. We had a WHO, the UN, all of these monstrous buildings looking really ugly and horrible. All of the creepy vibes, creepy weird things that we saw there. Do you know why they chose to put it just specifically here in Geneva, all of this stuff?
I mean, there are many rumors, and it would be worth it, to dig really deep, because it goes way back, even to stories around the Knights Templar, etc. I haven't gone as far back, but I can tell you, and I mentioned it earlier, that in 1815 at the Congress of Vienna, when they were reorganizing Europe, and after the Napoleonic War, I cannot pronounce that word.
Napoleonic War,
the Napoleonic Wars, there was a decision that was made specifically to choose Switzerland as the base for diplomacy, and it was there as well that it was kind of decided that Switzerland was going to be neutral as a country. And this is like one of the biggest lies that we've been told, that Switzerland is a neutral country, because it has been posturing as a neutral country all of this time. And the Swiss people were actually very upset when the Swiss government took a stand when it came to the conflict in the Ukraine, because it was supposedly breaking, with the tradition of neutrality. But when you know the history, you know that it was just publicly admitted that they were.
So in reality, Switzerland has been part of the globalist agenda for a long time.
Yeah, and you just have to look at all the different, special treatments that these organizations have in Switzerland. Switzerland, the government of Switzerland actually gave a very advantageous loan to the WHO to rebuild, to do some construction work and renovation work for their buildings.
And I heard something about the people working at the WHO and the UN here, that they can shop tax-free. They have special deals like that.
Yeah, they have diplomatic status.
Yeah. Okay. And one thing I want to ask you, because I've seen a diplomatic police around.
Yes.
Are they just specifically there for the UN and WHO guys?
Yes, and
so they got their own police force.
Yeah, and so ambassadors and certain members, of different missions, that are based here in Geneva.
Okay.
Yeah, it's like a patrolling force.
So I should probably have gone into a different branch of work. Then I should have applied for a job at the WHO or the UN, because I've seen them getting all the special treatment, all the nice cars chauffeured around, at all the expensive hotels I saw them come out of.
Rivage, you mentioned.
Yes, they were coming out of there looking like they had a great time, just had some nice dinners, all paid for by you and me, on taxpayers' money, all around the world, all different countries paying towards the UN.
It's a pay for play kind of system.
Yeah.
And I mentioned earlier that the member states are driving this process here in terms of relinquishing our sovereignty to the WHO. But some of these smaller countries, they are completely, at the mercy of, first of all, the entire structure with the loans that they can get.
Because there's so many banks and so on here, right?
Yeah, but just the structure with the IMF and the International Bank of Settlements, the World Bank. Yeah. So the possibility of them of getting certain loans is contingent on them adhering to the globalist agenda, to these new to this new pandemic accord, or to the amendments to the international regulations. So there's very much a whole element of backroom deals behind closed doors that are being made with smaller countries. And part of it is bringing these delegations here and dining and wining them, and bringing them to Beau Rivage, one of the top 3 luxury hotels.
Maybe giving them some nice Rolex watches, some nice Audemars Piguet watches as gifts, perhaps, as well.
Maybe. I don't know,
because I saw a lot of those shops down there by the river. Yeah. No, it's. I think you.
As Steve Bannon says, it's a beautiful place for shady people, or a sunny place for shady people.
It's definitely a beautiful place. I mean, it's one of the nicest, bigger cities that I've been to. It's definitely a beautiful place. I can understand why they chose this place too.
But as a Swiss, I'm Swiss from my mom's side. I was born here. I was raised here. Lived most of my life here.
Yeah.
I understand the vision that people have of Switzerland, from the outside, as this beautiful, clean, very organized place.
Yeah.
And very straightforward, or kind of clean in all senses of the terms. That's what I was trying to make. But it's actually a very dirty place underneath that veneer in many different senses of the term. And there's a lot of shady things that go on here, and not so far away from us. And so it's great that you came and that we can report about all of this.
Yeah, no, it's been great coming here. And is there anything else that you want to add before we finish off? You talked a lot a lot of good information about the WHO and all of this stuff that's going on here. Is there anything else you want to add on?
I'm sure I'll think of something when I'm walking around later or in my bed tonight that I may have missed. But no, I mean, whatever I missed, you can find on the website weheardothers.com. And you know, we put there are just so many incredible people denouncing the WHO's power grab, and so the tagline of our website, you know, We Heard Others, is everything you need to know about the WHO's power grab.
Yeah.
So just check out We Heard Others. We're also on Twitter at We Heard Others. Yeah. And then my personal Twitter is at Norbin Laden.
Yeah, so make sure to go and everyone watching this, make sure to go and follow both yours and also We Heard Others, and check out your website.
Thanks.
Yeah, and thank you so much for doing this interview.
Thank you so much for coming to Switzerland. It's so nice to have people from our team visit and, you know, report on this. So thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.